Everybody, it's lovely to see you. Thanks for coming. Yeah, it's all getting a bit sort of Christmassy now, so this is probably one of the last webinars that anyone's going to do before Christmas. So thank you for joining in. We do a whole series of webinars. We do about one a month, usually on big conservation issues, and but we wanted to mark COP15. So we wanted to sort of put Curlew Actions, sort of wave the flag for COP15 from our point of view. And we decided to do that with a public webinar on the GCSE and natural history. It was something that was agreed by the government after 11 years of campaigning. It was agreed in April this year, April the 21st, which also happens to be World Curlew Day, so that's very nice. And now it's in the process of chugging through the system and getting the criteria written, and then exam boards will write their own specifications, and there's all sorts of stuff going on in the background, but we have had a yes from the government, and that was the biggest step forward. And so we wanted to talk in the time when the world is talking about biodiversity, or certainly they are behind closed doors in Montreal. We wanted to see how a GCSE in natural history can fit into this landscape. So thank you for joining us. And I will start off by very briefly introducing our speakers this evening, and then I will let them tell you who they are and how they and what they do in the natural history area. So I'm going to start off with Octavia Bradley. Yes.
Brayley.
Brayley.
Slightly different spelling.
Sorry, Octavia Brayley. Octavia is a teacher and is somebody who studies zoology at university, is very, very interested in natural history and education. So we also have Emma Tuvey from the Environment Bank, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about the sort of the money side of natural history, if you like. And we have Nick Atchison, who, in my opinion, is one of the best naturalists in the country. So I am going to, first of all, go to you, Octavia, then to Emma, then to Nick, for you to tell everybody a little bit about yourself and why you think you wanted to take part in it tonight.
Sure. Thanks so much, Mary. Hi, everyone. Lovely to see you. Yeah, so I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Birmingham. I'm studying Antarctic biology, so I have a real passion for nature. And as Mary mentioned, I studied zoology at the University of Bristol before this as well. And I have quite a long history of teaching. I've been teaching on and off for about 6 years now, tutoring alongside my university degrees, as well as having taught at Harrow School in London last year as well, which was a really fantastic experience. So I've kind of been able to merge my love of teaching and science education alongside my science background as well. So yeah, I'm very much passionate about nature education. So it was brilliant to be invited to the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just remind everybody to turn their microphones off, apart from the speakers, thanks, so we don't get any noise in the background. Thank you. Next to Emma.
Thanks so much, Mary, and thanks for inviting me along today. So I'm a trained ecologist, and I've worked really as a consultant ecologist for the last kind of 20 years, primarily advising developers and construction projects on how they can really minimise their impact on the natural environment. And now I'm moved into a sort of a new role, which I can talk about a little bit today, where we're working at Environment Bank, where we're delivering nature recovery projects, landscape scale, really large scale nature recovery projects all across England. And we're working closely with landowners and farmers and funding those projects, making them economically viable so that we can essentially restore and bring back ecosystem resilience into our landscapes. So it's a really, really exciting time to be talking about natural history and careers in natural history, because there's a clear movement now and this area is booming. So thanks so much for inviting me along.
Thanks, Emma, very much. Nick, tell us about you.
As you said, my name's Nick Atchison. I'm a native of Norfolk and grew up being a naturalist here and have devoted my whole career to work as a conservationist for 10 years in South America. And then I came home to Norfolk, where I work with Norfolk Wildlife Trust, for whom I'm an ambassador. I'm a trustee of a small land management organisation called Felbeck Trust. I'm a trustee at Pensthorpe Conservation Trust, which is one of the facilities that Head Start's Curlews, and also active in a number of campaigns around nature conservation and the environment in Norfolk and across the country.
Thank you, you three. So I think you'll agree with me. We've got three amazingly interesting people who have really got very different perspectives to give us. So thank you for that. But the first question is the question that is the title of this webinar. Do we need a GCSE in natural history? And Octavia, is that a good idea, or is this barking?
I think the short answer is it's a fantastic idea. It's really needed. So before this webinar, I actually did a small bit of maths and research into the current statistics in terms of looking at the current curriculum with the different exam boards that we have in the country at the moment. And looking at all of those, I calculated that on average there's about 10% of the current biology GCSE curriculum which is ecology and biodiversity based. So it's a very small proportion of the biology curriculum. Not only is it a small proportion of the curriculum, but also in terms of when it's taught in schools. This seems to be quite common amongst all schools, and certainly where I was teaching last year. The ecology side of things and the climate change side of things seems to always be taught right at the end of the year. And I'm not entirely sure why this is the case. I think that perhaps it's potentially seen as a bit less of an important part of the biology syllabus, which is quite sad, really. And so it kind of ends up being taught at the end of the year, and students potentially don't engage with the content as much as some of the other bits of the content in the curriculum. And so there's this general feeling that ecology and biodiversity is not really appreciated in the biology GCSE currently as it stands. So from my perspective, having a standalone course where we just have a natural history GCSE, I think would be absolutely fantastic, especially for those children that are particularly interested in British wildlife as well, because there's not really any avenues that they can kind of pursue that at school. You know, when I was back at school, I was able to pursue that because I was lucky in terms of where I was living. I had a lot of nature around me. And I had parents that were also interested in nature, so I was able to pursue that quite a lot. But of course, kids that live in more urban areas and ones that don't have access to resources and things, they don't necessarily have many chances to actually go out and explore nature around them. So to answer your question, yes, I think a natural history GCSE is a fantastic idea, absolutely.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic to hear, Octavia. Emma, from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, 100% agree. And Octavia, I love your stats because I brought some stats too. And I think they're always helpful to get across the point. I mean, so I have two, and these just really, for me, are so compelling. And WWF obviously reported earlier this year that we've seen a 60% decline in biodiversity since only 1970, and actually that was just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, prior to 1970 we've seen such a huge decline in biodiversity across the globe. But also fundamentally, and a really incredible stat, is that 55% of global GDP, so our livelihoods, all of our economies, are completely reliant on what nature provides for us. So the natural environment literally supports society. And we're seeing this huge decline, 60% in a really short period of time. And without being too dramatic about it, you know, fundamentally, we rely on nature. And the reason why we've had this decline is because we probably don't really truly understand the impact that we've been having on nature for decades or hundreds of years. And that's why we're in this situation now. So bringing back that connection to nature, getting people to understand the impact that we as human populations have on nature is the first and best step towards us improving that impact and bringing a nature positive solution to society.
Well, thank you, Emma. They're quite sobering statistics, aren't they?
They are, yeah.
Both of you have highlighted a yawning gap, isn't there, between the reality of what's happening on the ground and how much we depend on it and how much we know about it. That really helps put it in context. Nick, as a working naturalist, are you welcoming this GCSE in natural history?
Well, you well know, Mary, that when the indomitable Mary Colwell asked me to agree with her GCSE, I quake and say, but yes, of course, Mary, it's an excellent idea. But it is not just because it's your idea, but it's an excellent idea for a whole range of reasons. And Octavia and Emma have outlined a lot of the statistical information behind why we so urgently need a GCSE in natural history. But looking at it from a range of different points of view, I think there are strong arguments right across the board. One is that we're failing our children in many ways, because many children don't learn in ordered classroom ways. They learn in all sorts of different ways. I've had a long period of my life that I devoted to outdoor learning, and I couldn't begin to list the number of times when teachers said, but that child is always impossible in the classroom, and outdoors the child was having the most amazing time, engaged with what the child found interesting and stimulating and easy to learn. So it's a way of providing a strand of education that is apt for many children we're currently failing. Many of those children may want to go on to careers in conservation. Now, I work with conservation organisations where all of the, and with no disrespect to the qualifications that we have between us here this evening, but many of the people who apply for jobs will have a degree, a master's degree, but they've never in their lives been outside. They've spent their whole lives learning numbers and looking at things in petri dishes, and they haven't actually engaged with the environments that they and their volunteers and their livestock and whoever else will be managing. And so we need to give people the tools with which to deliver the on-the-ground conservation jobs. And that begins that should begin with a nature table in primary school, but if it can't begin with a nature table in primary school, it's a very good idea for it to begin with a GCSE, which gives young people the opportunity to get outside and learn about the landscapes in which we ourselves exist, in which our society has evolved. And then to put a more emotive spin on what Octavia and Emma have both said, it was bound to come up. There's the famous quotation that was made particularly famous by Edward Wilson at the start of his book, The Diversity of Life, from Baba Dioum, the Senegalese thinker and forester, who said, in the end, we will save only what we love. We will love only what we know, and we will know only what we are taught. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a formal magisterial top-down teaching, but it means a giving of an opportunity. And I really do think it's true that it's impossible for us to have an emotional relationship that causes us to stand up and do something about it if we don't know what's out there. And the final point, which draws really on what Emma was saying about our economy and our societies, but we're this weird, hairless, over-intelligent ape that's evolved in the last moments of evolution of life on Earth. And for 200,000 years, our ancestors have depended on an intimate relationship with landscape, with natural resources, with seasons, with the coming and going of natural resources like birds or fish or whatever, and also a knowledge of the dangers that are out there. And suddenly, essentially since the Industrial Revolution, and even more so now in the digital revolution, he says, brandishing his phone that's right beside him, we are divorced. And for want of a better word, we are spiritually orphaned in the absence of a relationship with the natural world, which has been our constant companion and provider of everything we've ever needed for the whole span of our evolution.
Wow, that's quite a plea. That's quite. That's
well,
quite.
Get to it, Mary. Get to it.
I'm doing my best, Nick. Okay. Thank you, all three of you. Octavia, though, you made the point that a GCSE in natural history is a great idea. There's not much in schools at the moment, but is there the evidence that children actually want this?
Yeah, excellent question. You know what, that's a tricky one, because I think that because of the way biology is currently taught in school and the way things are taught in school, I mean, this could be a whole other series of webinars in terms of what I think about our education system in this country anyway. But, you know, as we all know, there's so much of a focus nowadays on we have this education and it's all about the exams. It's all about the exams, it's about the qualifications, and you're obtaining the qualifications to get to A levels or college and then to go on to university. And there's this real pressure amongst young people that they should be taking the best subjects to equip them with, you know, the core things that they need to know for the future and universities. So I think yes, I think young people absolutely do want it. I think it's potentially also the case that they might not know that they want it as well, because as I taught biology last year and, you know, we went more onto the ecology side of things, I actually got quite frustrated and I felt a bit unmotivated actually at some of the reactions I had from students, because they kept on saying to me, you know, why do we need to know this? Why do we need to know this? This isn't impacting us. And it really highlighted this absolute disconnect that a lot of young people have with what is being heard of in the news and what they're seeing on social media to what's actually happening to them, especially in, you know, in schools which the students are quite privileged and they've come from quite privileged background. I think that can as well sometimes happen. So yes, I think students absolutely want it, and I think one thing that could be particularly really nice with this GCSE is, you know, maybe saying this isn't just about getting a GCSE qualification. This is actually providing something so much more than just a school qualification. It's, you know, giving you chances to leave the classroom and understand the natural world around you, and, you know, have a completely different learning environment and a different experience with school. And I think that would, you know, probably help this first push when the GCSE actually comes out, you know, instead of focusing solely on kind of the exam side of things.
Yeah, do you think there's a danger that some schools will see it as too soft? You know, do you think that's an issue?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That is certainly an issue. And I mean, I guess it will take time for that to be seen as, you know, it's not a soft subject. I think one thing that should potentially be thought about as well is how is the Natural History GCSE going to fit in amongst the other current GCSE subjects? So for example, at the moment, you can take 3 separate sciences at school. So you can do biology, chemistry and physics. And you can also do combined science. So that's a shorter course for all of the 3 sciences. And instead of it counting as 3 GCSEs, it counts as 2. So I suppose there should be also some questions in terms of potentially, is it more likely that kids that are taking the combined science with the Natural History GCSE be a really nice kind of addition alongside, because then it would kind of make up a third GCSE. Are people going to want to take it alongside the other 3 separate sciences at the moment? So I think that would be quite interesting and something to maybe think about as well, and kind of how it's pitched to schools and how it's going to fit alongside the other subjects.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Emma, when it comes to the natural world and money, they're kind of uneasy bedfellows, aren't they? That we there's big debate. We shouldn't be putting a value on nature. Nature doesn't belong in the world of finance, and yet that's the world that you occupy. Give us a comment on that and how you think natural history fits into that kind of an uneasy situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I sort of touched on it earlier. I mean, I fundamentally believe that one of the reasons that nature has declined so much in the last however many decades is because we aren't valuing nature. We've expected it to always be there. It's a resource that's kind of infinitely accessible, and we can take what we want from it and we can exploit it, and it'll always be there. We'll be able to have clean water, and we'll always be able to take timber and forage in the forest, and it will always be there. And that's because we haven't valued it in the same way that we value the rest of our assets, if you like. And fundamentally, money makes the world go round. And I think in order for us to really build resilience back into our landscapes and restore nature, we have to make those projects economically viable. We have to make nature visible in the economy, and then we have to reward landowners just like we would pay for the crops that they produce. We also reward them for the nature that they restore into our landscapes, because they have a livelihood too to think about, and it shouldn't be a philanthropic thing. We need to do something at impact, we need to do something at scale, and it has to work economically to really, really fundamentally work, I think.
And how does see and natural history fit into that? Do you think that will help us to understand the economics of nature better?
I mean, absolutely. I think it's I work in an organisation where nature recovery is, fundamentally our core business. But the diversity of specialists that I work with every day, I work with economists, I work with very commercial people, that we need to understand, what makes an economically viable project, and that needs a whole range of different skill sets, not just, the specialists in the ecology sector. I've got botanists and I've got my birders, but I also need people to tell me, what does it cost to manage the land, to treat the land in the right way to regenerate nature.
So you think nature and money should be a lot more closely aligned than they are at the moment?
Absolutely, and I recognise it's definitely an area that people are uncomfortable with. I see those conversations all the time, and I understand that it feels wrong to put a number on nature, but I think we've tried to create a kind of nature conservation sector that's based on charity. And philanthropy, and people sort of giving money towards nature conservation simply out of the goodness of their heart. And there's some incredible projects and amazing work that's gone on in the NGO sector. But we're at a point now where we really need to make an impact, and really at scale, that needs to go much, much bigger than that. And so we need to, and let's get the private sector to pay for that. Let's take, the money from those that are having those impacts, those organisations that have an impact on biodiversity. They should be paying to bring resilience back into our landscapes.
Yeah, I think we absolutely have to have a webinar on should we pay for nature. What's the price of a curlew? That should be
What's the price of a curlew? That's a very good question.
But this one is on the GCSE. But that's great to know that you think that it will help train people to enter this new world where money talks, and money talks in the nature world. And I think that's an interesting perspective, and I'm sure we've got more to say about that. And then from you, Nick, enthusiastic as you are about the natural world, and enthusiastic as you are about telling people about it, is there a danger, though, that encouraging everybody to get out there and learn about it and be in it, that there's a tension there as well between too much access and the peace that nature requires to do what it needs to do? How do you square that one in your head?
It's a knife edge, and I've often reflected on this because I've spent my whole career encouraging people to have a relationship with nature, unquestionably for the benefit of people and for the benefit of nature. When by going to places they are funding the work that we do, that's a given. But especially following the pandemic, we have had an epidemic of what one might call bad behavior across the landscape. We've had all kinds of people traipsing all over the place, wild camping in places where really it's not helpful to biodiversity, lighting fires in a way that is of extreme danger to biodiversity. And we had 2 of the pandemic years, we've had terribly dry summers, so obviously that has an impact. Walking dogs off leads across beaches where ring plovers are nesting and little terns are nesting, riding horses across the same beaches. And every single one of those people has a right to be in nature, and their response would be, but I'm out exploring nature and loving nature, and this is how I worship nature. So it is a desperately tricky situation. following on from what Octavia and Emma said initially, first of all, we need nature to be vastly more robust and resilient and omnipresent in the way that really it would have been. Although for hundreds of years we've been driving large species to extinction, and particularly post-Victorian period. In the Victorian period, we waged bloody war on anything vaguely predatory, and we wiped all them out. But the real decline in quality of landscape and in the ability of our soils, our rivers, our catchments, etc., to provide space for nature and also the resources we need, that's happened really in the post-Second World War period, that we've absolutely plummeted. That period that's, well, we have in the State of Nature report, we document from 1970 onwards, but we've seen catastrophic collapses. And so in order for, as a no-brainer, as a default setting, we need there to be nature right across the landscape, and for there to be functional ecosystems everywhere that are providing space for all species, but also the resources that we all need in our environment as a species ourselves. But by so doing, we also provide much greater access to nature in a much more sustainable way right across the landscape. So I think it's a question of there being so much more cake to cut up. As a vegan, I don't eat a lot of cake, but a vegan cake to cut up. And then the impact will be spread more widely and less desperately critical in certain honeypots where people gather.
And how do you think the GCSE fits into that, getting that balance?
That's a very fine one. On the one hand, obviously, the GCSE's role, without being too cynical, the GCSE can be an excellent thing purely because people like to learn. And at the end of it, they have a qualification that is of interest and has taught them good things. In most people who do a history GCSE don't go on to use history in their daily lives, and the GCSE in natural history can be just the same, something they do that is of academic interest. But we also hope that it will switch on a light of passion, of interest, of commitment, and more people will become engaged. At Norfolk Wildlife Trust, we have literally just launched a new strategy, and one element of the strategy is to reach a far greater section of society and to engage them in action, because there's a great deal of evidence on social tipping points at which it becomes the norm to behave in particular ways. And although the GCSE is classroom education, there is a broader education that if more people in society are switched on to the vulnerability of our landscapes, of our wildlife, of our species, then they have a positive impact across society. And that's really what we have to aim for, not just through the GCSE, but it's an element in that.
So we're all sort of singing from the same hymn sheet here, aren't we, really? With some sort of edgy things that we need to sort out as time goes on. But so let's leave the question, should we have a GCSE in natural history? Because you've both so eloquently spoken out for it and given us some very good reasons why. But how are we going to make it interesting? How are we going to say to young people, look, this is really, really worth studying? I'm going to ask Octavia first, but I'd like you all three to interact with each other as well, and ask each other questions as you hear things. How are we going to make the teaching of natural history something that 14-year-old kids in today's social media driven world think, yep, I'm going to spend a couple of years of my life studying that? Any ideas, Octavia?
Yeah, I think there's two elements to that, really. The first is teachers have to be informed and equipped to teach it in their best ability. I mean, what we're seeing at the moment in education is many teachers, an alarming number actually, are teaching sciences, and they actually have very few science qualifications themselves. And I think that training of teachers to, stand in front of a classroom and outside the classroom, hopefully, is going to be really important. So I think providing some really excellent training to the teachers and some really good resources that they can use, especially as it's such a new qualification, is going to be really important. And I think there's the second thing about this as well is in terms of actually engaging the students and getting them excited. I think at the moment in the curriculum, all of the ecology, biodiversity based stuff in biology is a bit dry. And there's a lot of things like, you know, calculating the rate of productivity through an ecosystem, and I don't know, remembering definitions of ecosystem and population and community and things. And of course, they're all very important things. But when we're actually looking at the curriculum and realizing that there's only actually 10% of the curriculum that is based on ecology and biodiversity, and then you think, well, we're wasting that small proportion of the curriculum on strange things like definitions, which, you know, again, is quite classic to the education system, I think, at the moment. So I think it's going to be really the content of the curriculum. And I think something else which students really struggle with, I mentioned it before, is having those links between what they're learning in the classroom and what's actually going on in the world around them. So when I was teaching last year, I spent a lot of time doing extra stuff outside of the curriculum because we had time where I was doing a lot more case studies and saying, okay, so I'm teaching you about deforestation, but that's all very well and good, but I'm, you know, in the curriculum, you don't have to make links or talk about what's actually happening in the real world to do with deforestation, as an example. So I would then play them videos of deforestation happening in the Amazon and getting them to do their own research. And that really shifted, I think, their focus and engagement in the topic of ecology and natural history. So I think it's really important having clear links between what they're learning in the classroom to outside the classroom. And, you know, of course, also enabling them to leave the classroom and doing more outside learning is really going to help with that. Again, you know, doing some more interesting things outside. At the moment, they go outside and they put their quad rats down and they're starting to count different grasses and things. And, you know, I mean, I've taught that numerous times, and even I'm bored at looking at grasses now. You know, it's ridiculous. So, you know, it's quite dry at the moment. So I think it's making it all very more interesting. Having those clear links between what they're learning and the real world, and actually showing them, you know, if you understand this, then these are all the things that you can then go on to maybe do and change, and, you know, actually trying to inspire them more about nature. And then, you know, also ensuring that teachers are really well equipped and confident going in to teach the course, I think.
Anybody got any comments on that, Nick or Emma?
Go, Nick.
Oh, I'm very much in agreement with what Octavia says about the outdoor classroom. And I have a head start, people should know here, because Mary and I have wandered along the North Norfolk coast, chewing over these very issues and how we would present a natural history GCSE. And we sort of came up with the idea that really everyone everywhere has access to nature, whether or not they can see it as that or have been given the tools with which to explore it. So wherever you are, there will be somewhere within walking distance some kind of wetland. There will be somewhere within walking distance some kind of grassland, some kind of vaguely wooded habitat, without having to go very much further afield. And those are all directly relevant things to young people's lives. They're directly experiential. They're things that everyone can experience, and I think that's fundamental. And again, it goes back to, and Octavia was just touching on this, that there are children who learn in all sorts of different ways, and for some of them a much more experiential way of learning, a much more rooted, grounded, physical way of learning is going to suit them far, far better. And so this is an opportunity for them. It is exciting by its own nature, because it's the world we inhabit, but it is also directly relevant and very accessible to every child, and indeed every adult. If there are adults here who want to do the GCSE as adults, I'm sure we'd love to provide it for you too.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I was just thinking the reason why I became an ecologist was I was a city girl. My family had no sort of family relevance in ecology or that background at all, and it certainly wasn't instilled in me as a child. But doing my biology field trip and my geography field trip at school was literally the most inspiring 2 weeks of my school career. And I was like, when I was thinking about my degree, I thought, when did I have the most fun? When did I feel most inspired and motivated to what should be my next steps be? And I was like, well, It's got to be that, you know, and that was absolutely fundamental to my kind of career choice going forward. But I think linking to that, like I think it was one of Octavia's first points was some of the students are coming to her and going, well, why do I need to know about this? And for me, I think what would be really inspiring is if you show them at the GCSE level what kind of incredible careers they could have. And I think it's such an exciting time to be learning about natural history and greens. There's a huge green skills green skills gap in the sector. Hundreds of thousands of employment opportunities that can't be filled because we don't have the skills in place to fulfill those. Careers in the environmental sector are incredibly diverse. They're really fulfilling because you have this purpose and feel like you're doing something really practical to sort out all of this environmental mess that we've got ourselves into. They're really relevant, and they're fun. Like it's been such an incredible career that I feel like I've had so many great opportunities, and I think that's a really inspiring thing to talk to children about. And I have done, I've done a few sort of assemblies where you go and talk to kids about, your career, and I always get kids coming up to me at the end, like little kids, 5 or 6, going, oh, I want to do that. And I had no idea that was even a job, and that's a really powerful thing. So for me, I think telling them where it can take them, that future that they could have if they follow a career path along this route. And it's one of the biggest growing employment sectors. So there's every opportunity for them to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really positive message to get across, Emma, because we've got to get the fascination, the study of natural history out of the sort of geeky corner and into the mainstream. That this is what life is about, and it can be a really exciting and fulfilling life. And I think those are the messages that that haven't been told yet. But I am going to be a bit of a devil's advocate here, because I think all this would be do you think, so much easier if we were going to be launching this GCSE in natural history in Tanzania or Brazil? Isn't British natural history just a little bit dull, do you think? I mean, there's not a lot of things with big teeth and claws out there, are there? They eat antelopes, for example. So tell me, Nick, that I have got it completely wrong.
Well, I'm about to leave the call, Mary. I'm done, I'm afraid. It's over between us. I'm terribly sorry.
And so publicly.
For a start, yes, there is phenomenal wildlife to be seen around the world, but there are two things there. One, it's quite possible to teach a GCSE that's 90% experiencing British wildlife, and at the same time springboarding from that, using the unbelievable amount of resources that we have to talk about how what we see in Britain is the same process, the same basic concept that we can see in the Serengeti or in the Amazon or the Pantanal or whatever. So I don't really think that's necessarily a barrier. I also think, if I'm going to be as devil's advocate as you've been, you're underestimating the fascination that children inherently have for things when they're learning and for things that are going on around them, particularly younger children. But one hopes that we'd be creating pathways towards the natural history GCSE lower down the school system so that children are already fired up and interested. And the other, and with absolutely no disrespect to your career or your husband's career in the natural history unit, there is a danger when we focus only on the dramatic and the distant, that we ghettoize nature as something that other people have, when literally right there in my front garden there are 100 ducks, mallards all today because my widgeon has left, but there are 100 ducks right there, and wherever you live there is nature all around you at all times. We see, if you read, some people here will know the amazing book Red 67 that Kit Jewett and the BTO produced 2 years ago, and they've just brought out a new version called Into the Red, which sadly now has 70 species because 3 more have been red listed. And if you read in that, Alex Lees who is a very eminent ecologist, writes about sitting in the urban Pennines, listening to Arctic breeding ducks, common scoters, migrating over his house. There is nature moving in every sense through the landscape all around us. The sky is full of migrant things. The soil is full of life. Wherever there is a single tree, it is full of lichens and mosses and bacteria and invertebrates. And it's just a question of making that accessible in the right way, because it's so far from boring.
So are we into storytelling? Is this a GCSE in storytelling? In telling the stories of the creatures that live alongside us? Is that what it is? Is that how we're going to make it live in young people's minds? We tell them the most amazing. I was reading an article today and I got completely fascinated by this fly that lives in part of its life cycle in the nose of a deer. I mean, how wacky is that? You know, who wouldn't? What 14-year-old wouldn't want to know about a fly, a maggot that lives in the nose of a deer? It would have changed my life, I think, at that time. Do you think it's about storytelling, Emma?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is about storytelling. I mean, one of the things that always sticks with me is I remember asking my science teacher, why do we have lichen? Like, it seems so pointless. Like, what's that for? It's just like a little bit of like scaly stuff stuck on a tree. Like, why is it even there? And then the story of why it's there, and literally it's like the fundamentals of soil. Like, without lichen, it's that pioneering species without which there would literally not be pretty much life on the planet. And that was like, oh, like a kind of light bulb moment. And like, I think it's a storytelling, but it's those relationships and why it's relevant to us as humans and people, and our connection with nature, and why it's sort of that the story and that relationship with nature that's important. So yeah, I completely agree. It is that's what makes it come alive, isn't it? The story.
You must find that, Emma, Octavia, as a teacher, that that I suppose you have to balance that the stuff you've got to get people to know to pass exams, and the awe and wonder which is just wrapped up in the life of anything that we want to look at.
Yeah, it's really tough as a teacher, and it can be quite frustrating, I think, as a teacher as well, especially if you have an area of your subject that you're particularly passionate about and you're trying to, you know, create some passion in your students as well, and they're just kind of seeing this as, you know, well, I just need to know this to get to do the exams and things. I'd echo both what Nick and Emma have said, especially Nick, when you mentioned about you know, when we look at natural history documentaries, and it's often in other countries, and you know, I've certainly been guilty of that. When I was younger, I didn't really know much about the nature around me at all, actually. I was interested in it, but what I really wanted to do was I wanted to, you know, go to Africa and see the elephants and see the giraffes. That was kind of my push and my drive for doing zoology. And it's actually really only been after that, and kind of doing more of my degree and getting more involved with environmental things, that I've actually obtained more of a passion for British wildlife now. And, you know, I try and think back a bit of my education and work out why that is the case. And I think it certainly is just this not being connected to nature and not going outside and actually looking and seeing what things are, you know, around you at all times. It's amazing. You know, we often walk through the UK and through our parks and things, and we won't really actually stop and look around us. You know, we're looking down at our phones or you know, taking pictures or whatever it might be. And actually we often, in these busy lives that we lead, we don't often just stop and think, actually, you know, what's all of these animals and this amazing nature around me? And I think that's one part of the GCSE which hopefully will be really significant to young people, is actually thinking about what's around you and taking more time out, you know, from your own life to think about nature and getting more connected to nature. And I think that's going to be really important in inspiring young people, and especially echoing what Emma said about field work. I think that's absolutely right, that, you know, a lot of field work that we can do at GCSE and A level can be really significant for young people, and it can certainly inspire them. And I think also we have the ability now, especially with, you know, all of these online conferences and webinars, where it's actually easy to connect young people with other people doing certain careers. So I think, you know, people coming into schools that have ecology-based careers can be such an important thing. We have, you know, lots of programs now. I'm also a STEM ambassador, and part of that is I can actually go into schools and carry out workshops and do online talks and things, and actually show young people all of the things that you can do with science that isn't just medicine or lab work, which is something that I've often spoken about to young people. I think schools are partly to blame of this as well, that, you know, sometimes schools will want to say we've got X number of people into medicine or X number of people into law or whatever it might be. And that also can mean that young people don't know about all of the jobs that are out there for environmental and animal related work. So I often, just like Emma does, I will talk to young people and say, these are all the jobs you can do. That isn't, you know, you don't have to be a doctor. You can do so much more with your biology or your chemistry. And I think that's really important. And suddenly it is a bit of a light bulb moment, isn't it, Emma, where you suddenly see their faces and they're like, oh, I can actually go out and do all of these other things that I didn't know was possible. And I can get paid to go out in nature and do cool things. So yeah, I think having that link between careers as well is really important, and will definitely help inspire young people through this GCSE, I think.
Excellent. I'm going to touch on a slightly different topic now, something which I think is very important, something which is bubbling around in society, and when it surfaces every so often and we talk about it, and then it sort of gets subsumed in all the other huge issues that we're facing at the moment. But the connection between the natural world and young people's mental health. And I know it's a great concern to the government, it's a great concern to the teachers, and it's a great concern to parents and society in general, that whatever it is that modern life brings is not mental health to a lot of people. The fact that we have depressed young people is a great tragedy, I think. Do you think the natural history will help that? And how do you think it will help that? Nick, you kick off with that one.
Obviously, we have to be very careful. There's been a trend in the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of books, especially nature writing books, which basically the main message is, oh, nature healed me. And we must be very, very careful to avoid presenting a natural history GCSE as a panacea for children with poor mental health or who are struggling in the world they're presented with. However, if I just jump back to what we were just talking about with stories, I think one of the things that's very important, I was thinking about storytelling and history, the way we teach history. We're completely unafraid of stories in history. If we talk about the Norman Conquest, if we talk about Henry VIII, but we're also unafraid of a sense of giving children a sense of agency when we teach them about history. So, for example, many children will study the Second World War, and they'll study Nazism, and they'll study Auschwitz, and they draw moral lessons from that. And I think, going back to what Emma was saying earlier, one of the things that's very lacking, and one of the reasons that children are suffering greatly, and there's a very real condition of eco-anxiety, is that children don't feel they have a sense of agency in the face of the biodiversity collapse, which is being discussed this week in Montreal, and the environment collapse, which was just discussed at COP26. And children often feel that, well, I'm overwhelmed by this eco grief over which I have no control, in which I have no agency. Now, if we tell the stories in the right way and hook them into an interest, we can also teach them two positive, proactive things. One is the relationship between these things and our natural environment, which very often, for example, when you're learning the periodic table in chemistry, that's all very nice and it's quite abstract, or you're learning calculus or hypotenuses or whatever, it remains quite abstract for most of your life. Whereas with natural history taught in the right way, actually, the basic fundamentals of the environment crisis can be captured there, not necessarily in a thoroughly academic way, but in a relational way that we relate to these issues. And the second, as Emma was saying, and indeed Octavia was saying, we don't just say to kids, this is cool because you can have a career. This is cool because your career can be part of the solution. Your career can help make the world a better place. You are being empowered to take action. And that really is the fundamental thing that this can do. In addition to the fact, going back to the very first time I spoke, that we are evolutionarily, like every other species on Earth, an outdoor creature. And we exist spiritually in relationship to nature. And that's being denied to most of our city-dwelling children and to many, many of our country-dwelling children. And so this is an opportunity to give those kids who wish to have that relationship back again, or at least open the wardrobe to the Narnia that is nature, and give them that opportunity to step inside.
Is that realistic though, Emma? I mean, you were talking earlier, we said there is a green skills gap and that there are all these jobs out there. Is what Nick has just said, is that really on offer to young people? Is there that hope there for them?
Absolutely. I mean, I 100% believe that that careers in just the environmental sector as a whole are going to be it's a hugely booming area, and it's only increasing. Like we're seeing already organisations being required to report their impacts relating to carbon. Let's say, in particular, there's a very strong focus on carbon in the economy, and organisations are being asked to understand their carbon emissions and report against them, and also to mitigate and offset them. But there's a new movement, and it over the last couple of years, and likely to progress quite quickly now, where that's extending into biodiversity, and organisations and companies will need to understand their impacts on nature, understand how the relationships that all of their activities and their supply chains have on nature, and also to make sure that they reduce them. That in itself is a hugely complex requirement that's going to be asked of all of the organisations and companies in the economy, and they need people with these kinds of skill sets to support that. And also then the follow on from that is then how do we bring back resilience into the landscapes, doing things like the projects that I do day to day. There's a huge range of skill sets there. It's incredibly diverse, hydrologists, scientists, soil scientists, ecologists, specialists, generalists. There's so many opportunities there, and they're all really needed in high volume to get us where we need to go. And the demands from a policy and legislative context are going to only increase in the short term.
It really is, isn't it? It's quite well, the more we talk about it, and certainly all the meetings that I was in leading up to this, and all the sort of negative arguments that we had to overcome to get it actually agreed. That it was like barrier after barrier was just put in the road, and you had to find a way around it. You had to have an answer. You had to think bigger than the sort of small box that everybody got themselves into thinking about it. And then when you're over those barriers, suddenly you do think, well, actually, if this was something that came established around the world, we could be living in a very different world. If we got young people to learn about the nature wherever they are and understand how that nature connects not only to them and their country, their region, their country, but also connects us all together, suddenly we have concerned global citizens who care about the planet. And I think that's a very positive image that we can give to the next generation. I just hope that we can make it fly. I just hope we can make it sing. I hope we can find the teachers who have that vision and who can do that. And that's my next question. Do we have the people to teach it? And how are we going to get the people to teach it ready to hit the ground running in September 2025, which is first teaching? Octavia. A little for you there.
Yeah, I was going to say. So I think we do have the teachers to teach it, somewhat. Again, there are issues that we have in schools. Schools are many schools are over capacity. There are issues with workload for teachers, pay for teachers. The retention of teachers is unfortunately going down. So there are some unfortunate issues that might, be problematic for bringing through a new GCSE. I think that, we have to be aware of. I think as long as we, I suppose, have a look at which teachers can teach this GCSE. So, we can get biology teachers, geography teachers, all of those teachers which are already kind of involved in the natural world, and, ensuring that they are equipped to teach this course. But yes, I think there is potential for that to be a problem with the numbers of people needed. I think what's probably going to be more of an issue is actually you're going to get a lot of teachers which think that this is a fantastic idea and are really raring to go. And I think that the issue might come from the schools itself. And because we have this issue with schools being, again, not having necessarily very much money, being over capacity, I think I saw a figure recently that we're going to need about another 370,000 school places by 2024, which are going to have to be found somewhere. So, we do have this issue, I think, in the country with education and potentially with bringing this GCSE in place. So yeah, so I think it's really coming up with things which are going to appeal mainly to the schools. I personally don't necessarily think it's going to be the teachers where we're going to have the issue or the lack of people. I think it's going to be the schools themselves. Bringing in a new GCSE, they're going to have to think about timetabling. How is this going to fit in with the current timetable? Teachers are working 7-8 hours a day. Are they going to be able to teach another lesson throughout the day? Is this going to fit in? So I think unfortunately, it's all of those logistical things, which again are potentially quite dull. But I think unfortunately it's going to be those types of things which schools are really going to want to know about, and they need to have some form of incentive to bring in the GCSE. And this is something that I have been thinking about in terms of, are there some incentives that could be given to schools? So at the moment, there's an Eco Schools Green Flag Award, which Harrow obtained last year. And this was a way for a school to get some sort of kind of, not qualification, but another badge to their name where they could say, as a school, we are now an eco school. And I think that was a fantastic incentive for Harrow and other schools to get involved with that. And I think there could potentially be some room for something like that with the Natural History GCSE as well. And, really combining all of this positive stuff in terms of students' mental health, their skills, their careers, the health of the planet, the health of British wildlife, as well as also, are there some things that the schools can also say, we've taken on the Natural History GCSE, and so this has given us something that we can kind of, talk about and raise the profile of our school as well. And I think that could potentially be a way of overcoming some of these more logistical barriers, potentially.
Yeah, Nick, that's amazing. That's a very thorough answer, and I think that's interesting to make the distinction between the desire of teachers to teach it and the ability of schools to actually take it on board. So, and Nick, do you think we've got a problem with enough skills in the country at the moment?
Yes, we do, unquestionably. We wouldn't be in the mess that we're in if if society had nature front and center, if what Emma and Octavia and you and all the people listening know to be the case in terms of our environmental and biodiversity crises, if everybody knew that, there's no way we'd be in the mess that we're in, because everybody would be standing up and squealing about it. And despite the power of money, our politicians wouldn't have brushed these issues under the carpet for so long, because these have been issues that have been talked about for a very long time, and really precious little has been done. And we're in the last 10 seconds of injury time in terms of getting something done before our environment collapses and our biodiversity collapses, and with it our economy, our society, and so on. So yes, there is a very real problem. You and I, Mary, as you know, have talked about this before. One of the things that we really need to do is, as NGOs, as committed organizations, is provide the resources and the training for teachers, so that teachers have, not every teacher is going to spend their weekends pinning minute bark beetles to boards and looking at their genitals under a microscope to identify which particular species they are. I welcome such teachers into my life. However, not everybody's going to be doing that. But in the same way as a teacher approaching a GCSE in geography, in chemistry, in physics, there are fundamentals that are fascinating, interesting, engaging, that need to be learned. And those fundamentals are where we as conservationists, as NGOs, need to be working with the education system to provide teachers with the resources, the training, and the encouragement that they need in order to feel confident to deliver this. Because, going back to what Emma's been saying several times, the way to sell this to schools and to bypass the resistance Octavia has identified, and I'm the most deep green tree-hugging creature here, but nonetheless, I recognise the power of money. And if, as Emma rightly identifies, every business is now about to be obliged to look at its carbon impacts, its nitrate impacts, its biodiversity impacts, then that is a way of saying to schools, well, actually, this is the growth area. This is where there will be careers, and you would be very foolish to miss out on this basic grounding for your pupils.
Yeah, excellent. So just before we go to the questions that people have been putting in the chat, Emma, do you think the private sector has a duty to help fund the training of teachers for this? If they're going to be the ones that, you know, are going to benefit from all these new naturalists coming through the system, and we can't rely on public funding for everything, do you think that there's a possibility that the private sector will get involved in providing training?
I absolutely think there is. I think there's a huge role here for the private sector, not only to support with funding and resources and training, but also to raise the profile of the GCSE in the first place. And it feels like that's kind of a fundamental thing to the success of the GCSE, is to get buy-in from industry, buy-in from families, buy-in from children that, like, I really want this in my school. Why aren't you letting me learn about natural history? And the private sector have the resources and funding to support that in particular, I think, and saying we really need young people coming through the education system to learn about these skills that we really are short on. Please, can you know, come and work for us, but you have to go and, you know, do this GCSE. So yeah, a huge role there for the private sector.
Brilliant. I'm going to ask Ellen now, who's been in the background collating some of the things that people have been putting in the chat. Ellen, do you want to step in and fire some questions at the panel?
Yeah, sure. There's been some really good comments in the chat. One of the things that was asked a few times early on was the need to engage children from a younger age than GCSE. So I don't know who best would be to answer this question, but could somebody talk about the need for engaging primary school children? And then do we need to be doing work to engage kids who are maybe early secondary school, but pre-GCSE?
Kick off with that, Octavia, first.
Yes, yeah, that's a tricky one, really. I mean, yes, I think absolutely we should be engaging you know, as young as we, you know, as the people who are in school, primary school children, absolutely, to start that passion really early. I think it's tricky because with primary school education, it's often, I think, I mean, I'm not an expert in primary school education by any means, but I think it's sometimes kind of a bit more left open to the school in terms of the specifics that they are teaching. And it's not really until you start getting to key stage 3, so that's year 7 and year 7 through to year 9 pre-GCSE, that's when the first kind of official kind of more qualifications and curriculum start to fall in place. So that's when it's a bit easier in terms of kind of actually you know, putting in a curriculum into the UK. I think that's a bit easier to say, okay, you can now teach this and X, Y, and Z to the children. So I think, you know, absolutely engaging primary school children would be fantastic. I think it might just be a bit more difficult because there isn't that specific, this is what primary school children should be taught at that level. You know, it's kind of more left open to the schools. So yeah, I think there might be some issues there, but again, I don't know too much about the primary school side of things, really.
I mean, we do have forest schools, and you know,
yeah,
we used to have nature tables. Who remembers nature tables that come back? You know, there's more scope, but there's also less less organisation, I suppose, is the way of putting it. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a summary of what I was trying to say. Yeah, absolutely.
But what we do have with young children, and I'm sure, Nick, you've taught, I know you take groups of kids out. I mean, you're pushing against an open door, aren't you, a lot of the time?
Absolutely. From what you just said about the nature table, obviously without in any way undermining the crucial importance of primary education, the key thing that we need to get across at that level about natural history is how exciting it is, how it's everywhere all around us, and it can be a meaningful part of our lives. And so it's not a question of teachers having to have a lofty amount of knowledge to share. It's about teachers feeling safe and empowered to go outdoors, to look things up, to bring things back and look at them, which would have been absolutely normal until probably the 70s, and suddenly now is not something that we do for some strange reason. And a GCSE, one hopes, would create a vacuum behind it, whereby these things are seen from far away as becoming a positive thing. And also, to continue the chain, I teach on a degree course in conservation, and we are crying out for students to come to us who have had this sort of preparation, because we're trying to teach them conceptual stuff or stuff about land management or whatever, without the basic building blocks of understanding habitats and the species that make up habitats and the chemical and hydrological conditions that make up those habitats. Now, so from both ends, it's extremely important, but we need to build backwards down towards the nature table and upwards towards higher qualifications.
I always like to think of it. It seems to me that people go into careers in conservation a bit like you go for a career to be a sort of French chef, but you don't actually know what an egg is, you know. So you're sort of pitched in at this high level, and everybody thinks you know all these basics, and in fact we don't. And many people now don't know the basics at all. Thanks for that. Ellen?
Yes, so Heather wanted to ask, so obviously part of this GCSE is going to be fieldwork, but Heather raised the point that fieldwork often has a financial cost to schools and budgets already squeezed. And Claire made an interesting point to say, is the possible answer to this to try and enhance biodiversity within the school grounds? I don't know who would be best to answer that one.
Who wants to pitch off on that one?
I can start, I think. So yes, and that's certainly something which I think again will be a potential barrier to this. But fieldwork doesn't have to be far away. We don't have to go a long way away for fieldwork. So I think absolutely that really involving the outdoors, just outdoors of schools, there can be a whole lot of things. I mean, we designed last year in my school, we designed some field work based on think it was to do with lichens actually, lichens on walls and mosses and that type of thing, and we were doing some kind of experiments to do with that, kind of exploring their, I can't exactly remember what we were looking at, but kind of their optimum conditions and things like that. So I think that highlights that you don't have to go far afield for field work. I mean, ideally that would be fantastic if you could, but I suppose kind of keeping in line with the Natural History GCSE, which is all meant to be about kind of looking outside your door and understanding what's going on there, that actually you don't need to go far. Even schools in urban areas, you know, there are often parks nearby, for example, or trees nearby, and there can be a whole lot learned from just those small areas as well. So even though fieldwork, I think, is going to be a fantastic part of this, it's important that schools that are in urban environments feel like that's not going to take away from the experience of the Natural History GCSE, and that there are many other options for them and they don't have to get on a bus and travel 6 hours down the road. So yes, I think that's something to think about.
I think we talked about this, didn't we, Nick, when we were out, about how you could make the basic skill set apply anywhere. It doesn't matter where you are.
We did indeed. We talked about the fact that most children have access to a certain number of habitats, and that you could build a structure. So every learning experience, be it a GCSE or an A-level or a foundation degree or a degree, is fundamentally modular. There are chunks of information, and we talked about the fact that the habitat type, broadly speaking, could be the drawer in which you put information, and every child has some kind of access to a wooded habitat, to a grassland habitat, to a wet habitat. Now, some children have the phenomenal privilege of growing up on Lindisfarne and having beaches and freshwater wetlands and saltwater wetlands, and some children are surrounded by high quality national nature reserve habitats, and some children won't be, and they'll have to make some sort of expeditions. But even in parks, in cities, even in towns, there are habitats, and if you make the building blocks, the habitat types sufficiently broad, so you could, if you're talking about woodland, you could be looking at conifer plantation, you could be talking Caledonian pine forest, you could be talking alder woodland along a river, you could be talking a newly planted memorial woodland, you could be talking ancient oak woodland. Every single one of those ticks the box of learning about woodland and opens a door to learning about woodland types all over the country. So you make it relevant and accessible, but in a way that can telescope outwards towards an understanding of that type of habitat across the whole landscape and potentially beyond and into the world.
Can I just quickly add to that as well? I think there's also potentially a really nice opportunity here for schools to perhaps be a bit more connected as well. And so, for example, you know, if there was a school in an urban environment that only had access to a small park, for example, perhaps they could get in contact with a school that's done field work in a large nature reserve because they have a reserve near them. And, you know, potentially there could be some sort of scope for schools communicating and talking about their methodologies and the different things that they're seeing. And perhaps there could be a link up between schools and students all taking the Natural History GCSE to kind of, you know, link all of these different habitats together potentially.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Emma, before we go on to the next question?
I mean, I completely agree. I've just relocated from Zone 2 in London, and on our walk to school every morning with my 3 primary school children, we would botanise and work out what was growing in between the cracks in the pavement. I mean, I think there's an opportunity to do field work anywhere in England, and urban ecology is actually really some great storytelling going on in urban ecology.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. What else have we got, Ellen?
So Amber raised a really good point about, so she says, I think we also cannot ignore the help that local volunteer groups play in the development and support of this GCSE. And I think this might be a good opportunity, Mary, to talk about what stage we're at in terms of the development of the GCSE, and how can sort of nature NGOs get involved with what's going to be in the GCSE, and how can local nature groups support a school in the area that might be doing the GCSE?
Absolutely, there's a huge role for the NGO sector as the GCSE now starts to bed in and get established. We'll need all that expertise, we'll need all that enthusiasm, those resources, and there will be a public consultation on the GCSE criteria, and so people will be invited to give their opinions and their ideas. So that will definitely happen. We're just not quite at that stage yet, but we're not far off it. So absolutely a massive role for NGOs going forward, for sure.
James also raised a point. It's not necessarily a question, but I think it could be interesting to discuss more about how this GCSE has the potential to be a huge leveller in an industry that has a big issue in diversity of gender, race, identity, and class. Could someone talk about how this GCSE might impact that?
Go, Nick.
I completely agree with James on that point. One of the things that now North Norfolk, where I live, and indeed the whole of Norfolk, is very rural. There has been relatively little, especially to rural areas, immigration of non-white people, and it is very hard for us as Norfolk Wildlife Trust, with the best will in the world, to be more diverse. We're very aware how white we are. We're very aware how relatively privileged middle class we are, and we want not to be. And nobody should be saying that other people than white people, upper middle class people, should be doing natural history. But it is absolutely to our benefit as a society that everyone in society has an equal opportunity to become an agent in our environmental future. And that starts with an equal opportunity for everyone to engage with these ideas, to engage with this learning wherever they are, whether they're botanizing in pavement cracks, as Emma was doing on the way to school in London, or in whichever part of the country you live. It can only be to everyone's benefit environmentally and in terms of biodiversity conservation and landscape conservation if the whole of society is engaged and rooted in nature. And this has been changing. I mean, if one follows on social media, for example, the completely wonderful, the Muslim hikers, for example, who are going out every weekend and claiming these places for their own, being seen to be part of our wonderful landscapes, and therefore, as a group, loving the landscape and wanting to be part of its restoration and regeneration. And if the GCSE can help to bring about that change, then that is the most fabulous thing.
Mm. Emma, that must be something that you would welcome in your sector as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's clearly a huge challenge here, and similarly, you know, to Nick, we're constantly seeking ways to sort of remove the barriers for people from non-white backgrounds to access a career in ecology or the natural environment, and it's really difficult. And I think that the barriers are really complex, aren't they? That they're extensive and complex, but this is a brilliant leveller in that if every child has access to studying natural history, it can only help. I think for me, that connection with nature. So there are so many children that don't have access to nature, don't have a regular connection to nature, and therefore a career in natural history seems so departed from their day-to-day life. It's not relevant, and this can help change that. It becomes a real tangible thing, and also hopefully would give the opportunity to provide some representation as well from different backgrounds, and the GCSE can sort of have a responsibility there to improve representation for children.
Yeah, it's a massively important part of it, I think. You know,
yeah.
We will only be resilient, we will only face the future with a whole dynamic skill set if everybody gets involved. This can't be a little niche thing that only a few privileged people can do. That cannot be the case. We're going to wind up with one last question, Ellen, and then we'll say it's a night.
Yes, and I've now got to decide which one is the last question. Okay, we'll go with one more for Nick then. Alan would like to ask, and this is a Wildlife Trust specific question actually, he says, could the Wildlife Trust be doing more to nurture children's interests? And I guess we can also talk about that just from the perspective of NGOs, other NGOs as well as the Wildlife Trusts.
I think I know which Alan that is. If it's Alan Archer, hello Alan, it's nice to talk to you. Alan is a wonderful educator based here in Norfolk, and I saw his name pop up. So if it is you, if it's another Alan, hello also other Alan. Yes, the simple answer is yes. Wildlife trusts and other conservation organisations can be doing more. It is the Alan I know. Hello, Alan. Can be doing more. It is very, very difficult in that. So, for example, I can only speak from the point of view of the organisations that I represent or with which I work. At Norfolk Wildlife Trust, we are actually core funded by the so Norfolk Wildlife Trust has as one of its central tenets, in exactly the same way as it purchases land for preservation as nature reserves, one of the central tenets is to educate. So it is core funded. There's no external, well, there is external fundraising for projects to deliver education. So already Norfolk Wildlife Trust is financing a great deal of education. Often, and this is a real Achilles heel, and it's why we've just at Norfolk Wildlife Trust purchased our second urban nature reserve, with thanks to the generosity of huge numbers of people, including industry. We've just purchased another reserve in Norwich, which is a beautiful, beautiful reserve. And one of the strategic reasons for wanting to do this is that it is within walking distance of numerous primary schools, and numerous primary schools which actually sit within less privileged areas of Norwich. So one of the barriers, as I was saying in answer to Alan's question, is very often not what we as conservation organisations are charging, but the simple cost of taking time out from school, getting in a coach, getting to the place where the children want to learn. We've already at Norfolk Wildlife Trust again had in our other urban reserve, the other end of Norwich, called Thorpe Marshes, over the last year as a pilot, we have built a specific deep relationship with one school and given the teachers a great deal of training to help them deliver a nature club that we've helped set up, which will then be carried on into the future. So we can't do this alone. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about strategy, that we need to work right across society, every sector of society, and schools are our partners in this. But we perhaps need to break the model where in June, after the children have done most of their learning for the year, they get a day out to a nature reserve and they have a wild time, but we actually reach into schools to help teachers and young people learn together. And that's where I think wildlife trusts and other conservation organisations really are. It's that old thing about giving someone a fishing rod or giving them a fish and they eat for a day, give them a fishing rod, they can fish for life. It's very much that in schools that we help schools to deliver outdoor and nature learning rather than bringing to our reserves and for half a day once a year we say tick that box, we've educated.
Excellent. Well, on that very positive note, we'll wind it up for this evening, but thank you to Nick Atchison, to Emma Tuvey and to Octavia
Braley.
You can have permission to take me outside and beat me up at the end of this, Octavia. It's been a long year, I tell you, it's been a long year.
No, I know.
It's been such so interesting to listen to you talk from your different perspectives. And from my point of view, it's really, really exciting that this project is going ahead. I just want to fill the world with exciting natural history stories and create a nature literate society. And that will help us tackle these big issues that we are undoubtedly barreling down the track and that we have to face, as you say, with agency and with confidence. Thank you ever so much, guys, for being part of it tonight, and for everybody else for joining us and for your excellent questions and comments. We will be sending this round. If you feel you can support Curlew Action, please do. We really, really would appreciate it. But thank you again, and we'll see you for the next webinar. And good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.